Hey y'all, McKay Simpson here. I'm the senior pastor of University United Methodist Church in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And it's a privilege to be able to come to you again on this midweek devotional space that we created at the beginning of the pandemic last year. It's hard to believe that it's been almost 365 days that we have been navigating these times together. And yet still, I'm so thankful that we have stayed true to offering some inspiration and deeper reflection, sometimes even conviction and challenge to you in this time where we all need a word of hope and to be reminded that we are not alone. And so obviously you can see I'm in our backyard. You can see that it's pretty cold with my breath being able to be seen in these frigid temperatures. And my heart is with you, just hoping that you have had electricity and heat most of the time, that you've had the provisions in your home that you've needed, or if you haven't, that there have been family and chosen friends that have helped along the way. And these past few frigid days have led us to the beginning of Lent, Ash Wednesday, where we begin a 40-day journey as Christians around the world together. You know, this time where we have been even more isolated than we have been with the snow and the ice, not being able to get out on the roads, not being able to travel to the grocery store for those few things that maybe we forgot over the weekend. I've been thinking a lot about wilderness, that wilderness that isolates us in some ways and then makes us maybe pray different prayers and see different things. I think about, children that had expectations of snow in South Louisiana, particularly Baton Rouge, going to bed Sunday night and then waking up Monday morning in this frigid cold where they couldn't go anywhere. Sometimes their parents wouldn't even let them go outside because it was sub-freezing temperatures, and yet they didn't even have those points of joy with, as my kids said, real snowman snow that they were hoping for. You know, I bundled my three up and brought them outside, and they just kept on looking at the ground dejected and completely forlorn that they didn't have this milestone experience of being able to throw snowballs at each other in a snowball fight or build their Frosty the Snowman in their own way. We didn't have carrots in the fridge, but we were planning on using zucchini for a nose and some other creative items for creating a face and buttons and all of that. And all of that didn't happen. And yet, without any prompting from me, I found these little people, after a while of looking on the ground, beginning to look somewhere different. And they looked up high, up in the branches that really were within arm's reach. And they found themselves just wide-eyed and excited about the icicles that they found, wondering, what are these things? Told them what they were, and they said, well, they're popsicles, right? So they were looking every single place, on a car, on trees, anywhere that they could find, trying to find the biggest icicles possible. And that wonder and excitement of even a winter wilderness came to these little hearts. I found myself thinking that, man, they're a lot better than we are as adults of finding a new place to look in the midst of wilderness times. So many times, I know I am, maybe you are, captivated by those dreams deferred or those ways where our hopes and our expectations had been dashed and disappointed. And the wilderness isn't very kind to us in those expectations and those dreams. So it's no wonder that over the course of generations, we have not been wilderness people. We have become more and more urbanized. We have taken our very small tribes that we survived with and have put them with others and thousands and more thousands of people to create these urban centers that frankly give us a greater sense of comfort, greater sense of structure, greater sense sometimes of stability that, when we have a winter crisis here in a place where we don't know what to do, there'll be firemen that come to save people that need saving, or you'll have an electric company that serves thousands of residents whenever trees fall and crack and break from the ice and put down our power lines. There is support that as human beings we desperately need. And so the wilderness tends to be a place not where we live, but we like to visit every once in a while. It's kind of a place to get our kicks, or maybe find some deeper peace, or maybe a place where God seems to show up because the noise of our usual distracted living is quieted for a moment. But we definitely don't stay there long because it's, frankly, not that fun all of the time. But in Lent, this season that we are beginning to journey through together over these 40, even more than 40 days, this is exactly what God is calling us to do, to live in that place. And for men and women, you and I, that have frankly been living through a Lenti kind of season of darkness and shadows over the past 365 days, it might seem like a tall order or a little too much to ask. You know, when I find myself thinking that, I find myself turning to the desert mothers and fathers who were faithful men and women that charted that course before us, that show us that we can survive through desert and wilderness times, and might even find ourselves stronger for experiencing those moments. Desert mothers and fathers were frankly mystics, kind of in the monastic or ascetic tradition, people that largely lived their lives in sacrifice and meditation. There are even stories of many of them, women and men, that were well-to-do and had all of the trappings of a successful and rich life in the world, but they felt that call of God to pull away from those comforts and that security, to challenge themselves to live in deeper trust. And so they pulled away from the urban centers. They frankly relinquished all of the beauty and the riches that they had to others, sometimes to the poor, and found shelter and began to wander in the wildernesses outside of urban centers, in the places of greatest desolation, and with a lack of certainty about where they would be able to survive and what sources of of provision they would have. More than any of us could ever imagine, they allowed themselves to trust God and to have just enough for the next day to be able to walk in the ways that God would lead them. Along the way, they found themselves, as the stories are told, praying for those in the city. They found it as their vocation, as their call, to pray for those that were living, quote unquote, a normal life. And yet still, they learned so much and were strengthened deeply by a long obedience in learning how to follow. You know, in the early centuries, the Christian church found itself not allowing any person to be raised up in leadership, let's say as a bishop or someone that is leading a large group of the faithful. They wouldn't let anybody even begin to be considered for those kinds of shepherding roles until they had lived a long obedience in the desert, in the wilderness, that they had known truly what it had been to be a disciple of God, so that they could teach others what that means in everyday life as well. You know, these people, they weren't always so confined and constrained as we are today, trying to be boxed in by right doctrine and right belief, even though having those trappings of grounding and rootedness in tradition is so important. But when they talked about their faith, they were so much more characterized by the stories of both abundance and scarcity that they had experienced. And they helped people understand what it was to be human through talking about those stories that they knew of love and of relinquishing ego and finding virtue and surrender and peace, divine union, and inner freedom from just simply showing up to life and trusting that God would give them everything that they would ever need to be able to live in the next day. I'd like to suggest that most of us would not have the strength or the willingness to be able to live that kind of life. And that's okay. Each of us find our different ways of living as faithful people. But we have had a piece of it living in that disorienting feeling over this past year. I've been doing a little bit of research on what it is to live in wilderness and in desert, and it's been fascinating finding that scientists have been doing some studies on people that have lived in these trying times, not knowing really where to go, what to do. Frankly, people that have been lost, either physically or spiritually. And a lot of times it's a little bit of both. But there's research that's been done that scientists have discovered when people are in those times of wilderness and desert for a long time, let's say for a whole 365 days, they really can find signs and evidence that the human body even is predisposed to start wandering in circles. That really, because of neurotransmitters and hormones and all sorts of different signs that they can point to in the human body and in the brain, that we are predisposed to find ourselves traversing those places that we've gone to before because we seem to have no other choice. It's kind of a survival mechanism. And we'd think that would be just ominous. That would be awful, right? But there is some sense that it could actually be a gift. Just like those of us that may have been traversing through whatever wilderness we've been experiencing, maybe it be grief or a seeming lack of success, or the usual trappings of what it is to achieve in your work life or in your life personally. There's all sorts of lostness that you and I can give witness to right now. And maybe we have been circling around in some way, shape, or form in a way that makes us feel crazy. But there is a circling in Lent that every single year, as we circle through the stories, that it seems like it's insanity to go through the same stories again and again and again, but it gives us just enough of a ground of knowing to remember that we will survive. And in fact, that we may thrive eventually as we find those signs and symbols around us to help focus our gaze and allow us to know that we are beginning to walk straight and beyond those places that we have gone before. The researchers have said that it's only when people can find those glowing orbs, the sun or the moon, that can help us know that we're going in the right way or the right direction, that helps us travel in a way that is sure. But in those times of darkness and shadow, it seems almost impossible. Well, Lent is a time where we do disorienting things. It's hard to confess our sins as human beings. I know it's really hard for a lot of us to actually admit those places where we've missed the mark, maybe admit those places where we're lost in a culture and a time that doesn't value lostness at all. But Lent promises that the times of dark and shadow will not be forever, and that there will be a rising sun that will shine over the horizon to help us fix our gaze and begin to walk forward with confidence once again. And so I hope that through this journey, we can allow ourselves, in the midst of our lostness, in the midst of our disorientation, to actually be gentle with ourselves, to not be too hard as we seek God's voice and continue to seek forgiveness and absolution from one another for the places where we have fallen short in community together. Maybe the greatest gift that we can offer God and ourselves is by being kind to each other and kind to ourselves internally. Because really, one of the greatest things that we can celebrate today is just showing up and continuing to walk through the story that God is writing in each of our lives. So I hope that we can be grace-filled enough to ourselves, that our minds can be open to the love that God will offer as we find ourselves looking maybe down on the ground for real snowman snow, but God might be pulling our gaze up to a different place to find other shiny gifts that bring new wonder to our lives. So wherever you are today, whatever struggle you might be having, frankly, whatever resistance you might have to living the commitments that Lent calls us to offer God in these moments, maybe it feels like it's just too much or too heavy. I pray that this journey will continue to be blessed for you, however you choose to spend it. May we observe a holy Lent, being reminded once again that the only memory that truly matters for us is how much we are truly cherished by God. May it be so for you and for me today and always. Amen.